Hi, this is Clare Kosnik. Hi, MT students. This is my first time doing a screencast, so if there's a few blips, please excuse them. And this is So Tell Me What You Think, the art and science of interviewing. And this is me, Claire. I teach in the MT program Year 1 literacy courses for PJ and JI. Interviews are one of my favorite ways to do data gathering. I calculated out that in the last 3 years, I've done 120 interviews, and I've developed 7 sets of questions. So you can tell I really like interviewing. And you think of interviewing as just you and your interviewee. Wrong. You need some assistance. And here is my little assistant, Poochie. And while you're developing your interview questions, once you have them done, you want to check them out with some of your friends and colleagues, and I'll tell you why as we go along. So there's my little assistant. The use of interviews is very widespread. We go to the shopping mall and somebody comes up to ask our opinion. Oh, what do you think of this product or that? Or you pick up the telephone, of course, just when it's the climax of a TV show and there's somebody who wants to conduct an interview. This proliferation of interviews suggests that anyone can interview, and you can just go ahead and do it. And I think this masks the complexity of interviewing. It is hard work, and as the title of this presentation said, it is an art. How do you put your interviewee at ease? You're listening really carefully. Do I ask a probe question now? Is it clear what he or she is saying? And it's also a science, because your questions have to be really well worded and they have to be well sequenced. One thing that I have found working with novice researchers is they think that an interview is a conversation. Wrong. It is not a conversation, because you have a set of questions that you have to get through. And if you start to have a dialogue with the person, that will interrupt the flow of the data gathering. So think of your interview questions as a tool. And you're going to have to spend time. Time is one of your most precious resources when you're interviewing someone, because that person, probably a teacher, is really, really busy and you've got that individual for 30 minutes. So you want to make sure that every one of your questions that you ask will get to the your main research questions, so you will elicit the information that you need. You want to be sure that your research questions and your interview questions match. What I do when I'm developing interview questions, I have my main research questions on a Post-it note right beside me, and I keep going back and forth to make sure the questions I'm developing will give me the information that I need. Something else to keep in mind is even if you have that participant with you for an hour and a half, you're still not going to be able to cover every single thing you want. So you want to spend some time thinking about what are the most important aspects of the research questions that I need to get some information on. Now, here's another part of time. I'm a really, really good typist. And for me, when I'm transcribing a 1-hour interview, 1 hour, and I'm a good typist, it takes me 5 hours to transcribe. So if you're not such a good typist, it's going to take you a while. And there's some pretty good software that will help you with transcribing. Here are 2 little mottos that I have. The quality of your instruments equals the quality of the data. If you don't have good instruments with carefully worded questions, you're not going to get very good data. And the quality of your data is directly connected to the quality of your research findings. So your instrument is probably one of the most important aspects of the whole research process. Now, developing the questions. It takes time. I go through many, many iterations, because what you want to be sure is that the question is crystal clear to the person who's listening. It may be clear to you, but that's not good enough. You have to make sure that there is nothing open to interpretation. What I have often done is pilot my interview questions to make sure that they are well worded and that they're well sequenced. You want to talk to your friends and colleagues in the MT program and have them look at your questions to make sure the wording is exact. Now, here's some poorly worded questions. So this question, why don't you let your students use the computer for writing? Why is it a poorly worded question? First off, it puts the interviewee on the defensive because you're suggesting you're not a good teacher. You're not letting your students use the computer for writing. And secondly, the minute you put a negative, no, not in a question, the interviewee has to work really hard to figure out what it is you're actually asking. So rephrase it in a much gentler way. To what extent do you let your students use the computer for their writing? It's nice and open-ended. Then you can follow up with what are the benefits and what are the drawbacks. So by having that 3-question sequence, you will get at exactly what you want to know without putting your interviewee on the defensive. And remember, in your research project, Chapter 5, that's where you can share your views. It's not while you're collecting the data. Next problem with interview questions is often they're too broad or not doable. Here is one a student had last year. What is the impact of reflective journal writing on students' self-esteem? It's a huge, huge question that isn't doable because the minute you put the word impact into your question, that means you have to have pre and post data so you can look at what the impact is. And you've got so many things going on in this question. Impact, reflective journal writing, student self-esteem. It's too much for the interviewee to think about, so don't even go there. And next, asking leading questions. Here's the leading question. Why are boys less interested in reading than girls? A, that assumes that boys are less interested, so the teacher is listening to this and that might not be her experience. And again, it is sharing your views that you think boys are less interested in reading. So rephrase it. And this is a beautiful wording. From your work as a teacher, have you noticed a difference in the level of interest in reading between boys and girls? This way, your interviewee can say whatever he or she believes, draw on their previous experience. Then, if they say yes, you follow up with a probe question, which is at purple. Why do you think there is a difference in the level of interest between boys and girls? If you want more scientific fact, this is where your literature review comes in. We're not having the poor teacher try to address this vast interest. Let them talk about their expertise. So now I'm going to walk you through a student, Celeste Dixon Kirsch, her research project. And here's a picture of her. She's on the left with black hair. And she did spoken word in the literacy classroom, Stories to Yell. And it's fun to have a good title. Now, her research project was very solid. She published from her research project in a peer-reviewed journal some of her findings. When she went for her job interview, the principal asked her about her work, and she was just blown away by the research she had done. And now, as a 7th grade teacher, she uses the research that she did in her work with students. So is that not the perfect research project? It contributed to the literature, it helped her get a job, and she uses it in her teaching. So it's sort of the best kind of research. And often I hear MT students say, well, what can I learn in 30 minutes? Well, Celeste did 2 30-minute interviews and was able to publish in a literacy journal about her work. So here's a picture of my research group. And there's Celeste, 3rd on the right, and I'm standing 2nd on the right. This was a terrific research group that I had a couple of years ago, and we had a brunch reunion last year because we got along so well and we all learned so much from each other. And that's something you want to think about with your research project, sharing your questions, your findings with each other. All of these folks, all of these women, they've all got teaching jobs, and we had just an amazing time together. Now, Celeste initially really wanted to do slam poetry. This was a personal interest of hers. And that's something with your research project. You want to do something you're really interested in. But once she started looking for participants, she realized she couldn't find any classroom teachers who were actually doing slam poetry. So we had to massage her question, and it morphed into her main research question: how can teachers incorporate spoken word poetry into their literacy program? It is crystal clear Then she developed a series of sub-questions, which you can read on the screen. Why do educators choose spoken word? How do students respond? Does using spoken word create or strengthen a learning community? How does it help students engage? And what resources exist? So these sub-questions emerged as she was doing the research. One thing you want to be careful with, you've worked on chapters 1, 2, and 3, and you've got your research question. But you know, every research project I've done, my main research question evolves, and there's many iterations. As you do your research, as you read, your question will evolve. Don't feel boxed into what you wrote perhaps in October of year 1. And that's fine if it morphs. Okay, so when you are going to interview your participant, or you don't want to send them the questions beforehand. So let's back up a tiny bit. Developing your questions. A way to think about them is having them in chunks. That's right, chunks. And I'm going to walk you through the questions. And you want to have probably 4 or 5 chunks. And these will match your research question and your sub-questions. I highly recommend that you do not send the questions to your participant beforehand, because what I have found is you send them the questions and then they write out their answers. Then when you go to interview them, they're so busy looking down at what they wrote, you lose the whole spontaneity of the interview, and it becomes really tricky to ask probe questions or clarify because they're so tied to what they've written. So when you start the interview, tell the interviewee the interview is going to be about 30 to 40 minutes. There's going to be 4 parts. And the point of that is so they can pace themselves. And you immediately write down what time you are starting. If it's 12:20, 3:20, so you know what time you started. So the first chunk of questions, here it is background information. Because you want to get a sense of who it is you're interviewing. So you get a sense. And the second reason why you have the background information as your first chunk is it puts the interviewee at ease. Even though these are classroom teachers or perhaps consultants or principals, the minute you turn on a microphone, people get a little bit nervous. So you want them to just relax. So you start with easy things. What do you teach? Where do you teach? How many years? How did you become involved in spoken word? And then for Celeste, she wanted to get a picture of the students. What are they generally like? What is their life like outside of the classroom? Because this really bears on the whole idea of spoken word. And the first chunk, you want to be super careful that the person doesn't start giving you a life history. Well, when I was 14 years old. No. You want to try to move through the background info so that you then get to the heart of the questions. Okay. The second section is on the teacher practices. Think of that as the what and the how. Most teachers are really, really good at telling you what they do. So follow up the nice first chunk on their background to what it is they do. So for Celeste, the first thing she asked is, how do you incorporate spoken word poetry? And the probe question is in purple. And she really wanted to know, how did this interviewee know that spoken word poetry should be taught? To what extent have you supported students? Have students supported each other through the creative process? And then our probe question is, how has this impacted? And then her interview question number 8, I remember quite clearly saying, Celeste, don't go there. Tell me more about how you assess spoken word. But I said, you know, you could get really bogged down in that. But she said, Claire, I really want to know that. So if it's something you really want to know, put it in there. And you can also ask your friends as they read your questions, do you think this is too many questions? Or will we get bogged down here? And so that was section 2. Section 3 is on their beliefs and values. This is sort of the why question. What prompted you to begin to use spoken word in your classroom? And this you may be so surprised when you are asking a person, like, why are they doing this? And then, what do you believe students can gain from spoken word in the literacy classroom? And that is such a beautiful question because it brings in a little bit of the student presence into your data. Now, in this part, usually section 3, I like to have a question or two about what resources do you use. Celeste did not ask that directly, even though I suggested she do, but she did end up getting a lot of information about the resources because part of the goal of the research project is to help you learn how to be the best teacher you can be. And if you can find out some of the resources for a topic you're really interested in, that will serve you well. And another reason we have this section on the why is the spoken word in slam poetry is a little bit controversial. So we want to know, why do you think you should be doing this? Section 4 was the influencing factors. We really wanted to know, why are you doing this? And have you faced any obstacles or challenges when using spoken word in your teaching? Because Celeste suspected that some of the teachers would have had some resistance from their colleagues or parents. And then her question number 11, what kind of feedback have you had from people outside the classroom regarding your practice of using spoken word in the classroom? Because we wanted to know, how did people feel about her using the spoken word? And that we suspected that the teachers who were using spoken word probably had some videos of slam poetry. And anybody who's watched any slam poetry knows that it can be a tiny bit edgy. The final section is the what next. And this is who must be included in a spoken word unit. So that again is finding resources. And question 14 is one you all want to ask. What advice would you give to a beginning teacher looking to include spoken word in their classroom? If you've got good participants who are good teachers, that is one of those bingo questions that will give you so much information. And then the last one is on the goals, because that is often the hardest part for teachers. It's easier for them to talk about what they're doing, how they're doing, a little bit on the why, but broad goals, they often don't necessarily talk about that. So we left that till the end. So those were 15 questions, and they took around 35 minutes, and they were very rich interviews. So some helpful hints for interviewing. Know your questions well and the order of them. When I'm interviewing, trust me, I go over and over and over those questions beforehand so that I have them memorized. I know what they are. You want to use probe questions to get to the heart of the matter. And here are some really useful ones. Was it helpful? Why was it helpful? How did this influence your practice? Because one of the issues around interviewing is you use your frame of reference when you were listening to when a person is speaking. So if you're a person perhaps who didn't really like or you really love spoken word poetry, that's going to filter what you hear the teacher saying. So part of what makes interviewing so truly exhausting is you have to listen so carefully to make sure that you know exactly what that person is saying, and you're not using your assumptions, you're not interpreting, and so often you use a probe question to make sure you're both on the same page. 15 questions, you want to try to ask all the questions. However, if the participant gives you an answer to question 14 after question 3, don't ask question 14. And you do want to move it around because, as I said, time is so precious. So you use bridging statements. Don't say something like, you're talking too long, I have to move on. You just do something really gentle. We're now going to move to some questions on the topic of X. Or that answer leads directly into the next set of questions which are on. So these bridging sentences move the interviewee along. You love examples because they're informative. You want to elicit them, but you don't want the teacher to describe the entire unit he or she has just taught. Because if you have 30 minutes and they spend 10 minutes describing what they did in their unit, that's not so interesting. It's not going to necessarily help you. Try not to lead the interviewee by sharing your views. You're not engaging in conversation. Don't get bogged down. And guess who's back? Poochie's back. There he is. So I want to wish you all the best in developing your interview questions and your research. The questions that I have presented here, use them as a model. You don't need to recreate the wheel. I have given Arlo 3 sample methods chapters from previous students, and in there I included their interview questions. The interview questions are here. Use them. These are well-worded questions that we spent lots of time developing, so use them. Have fun. Take time. And as you're looking at this picture of Poochie and you're thinking, oh, isn't he cute? Here's my quiz for you. Can you find the second picture of Poochie in this slide? See you around, Oisy, and all the best.